All right. And hello, hello, hello. You are listening to WBIM FM 91.5, Bridgewater State University's Morning News with Wayne, with your host, Wayne, coming at you with an interview. Today we have Steve. Would you like to say hi, Steve? It's okay. You just talk.
Yes. Steve Elliot. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Wayne.
It's nice to have you here.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. How has your week been so far?
Nice. I've been planting bulbs, tulip and daffodil bulbs, lots of them.
Nice. Is it? Those will like bloom when it's spring again, right?
Yeah, like early spring.
Okay.
April. We're talking April and May.
Cool. I suppose we could get started getting right into it. So, would you maybe like to explain just like your affiliation, like how we came to meet for doing this interview? Just
Yeah, the way we met was I happened to hand you a flyer calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and against the genocide in Gaza, and that was last spring.
That was last spring, yeah.
And we met again, happened to run across each other again earlier this fall, and I had an updated, I think I'm in my 14th edition of my flyer, trying to keep up with events. And you remembered me, and we set up the interview. That's kind of how we met and how I happened to be here.
Okay. I know that's a weird question to ask, but I think
no, it's okay.
I think it's nice to give your side of the story, because I just go up to people and I'm like, "Hey, you seem cool. You should come on air."
Yeah, I'd like to hear your side of the encounters too. But anyway, that was I have since this. Whatever we should call it and what we call it is an important question too. I think we can fairly safely call it a genocide or a massacre that's going on, yes. And I'll get into that more. But since this happened about a year ago, I've been more or less on my own, but sometimes affiliated with other people. But I've been agitating for peace and a ceasefire. And I hand out flyers and I hold signs. Sometimes I go to a demonstration called by some group, but often I'm on my own.
Nice. Lone wolf.
Lone wolf, well, exactly. Or some people call me a lone nut, but that's okay.
Well, hey, nuts come from a tree, so there's others like you.
Right. And olives too. But we'll come back to olive trees. We'll come back to olive trees too.
Yes, certainly.
An important part of the story.
I guess with that, I suppose we could just get started.
Yeah, sure.
That's okay. All right. Where did your journey in activism begin? Was there a pinnacle moment that, quote unquote, set it off?
Yes. I grew up on I was born in 1949 and grew up on a small dairy and turkey farm in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. So I guess that makes me a classic boomer in that age group. And by the way, I know a few years ago there was this saying going around, or a meme or trope or whatever, and people would say to boomers like me, it was, "Okay, boomer," because we start reminiscing about the 60s and going on and on and on. Yeah. And so our younger listeners will say, "Okay, boomer." So if you want to say that to me, that's okay. In fact, I might need a little direction.
I only say it to my dad when he's when he's making me angry.
Oh, so you've heard of it? You've heard it? Oh, good.
And I've used it.
Oh, you've used it? Even better. So okay. So yeah. So I grew up on a farm in Vermont, and as far as like activism, there was a lot of ferment, a lot of talk. The civil rights movement was fully underway. Singers like Pete Seeger and Joan Baez were at the top of the charts, and even like small colleges like Lyndon State College in my immediate neighborhood in northern Vermont, even places like that by 1965 were having by the way, the civil rights movement was going on, and the Vietnam War started really heating up, and massive troop commitments started happening in about 65. So by 1965, even a small college like Lyndon State College was having what we called teach-ins about Vietnam, and people were talking and debating and grabbing each other on the street corners and arguing, and it was a time of ferment, and I was caught up in it.
Has your time in striving for what is right, like your activism, has been met with any major resistance, either from the general public or even someone that you have a close connection to?
In a word, no. In fact, I thought about that question. I've thought about that, and I had many childhood friends who actually served as military people in Vietnam, and I never had problems with them when I went to prison, and I'll get to that in a minute, but no. And maybe I should backtrack for a second, and when you say whether there was a pinnacle moment, and I guess that begs the question of what did I do and what's my story. I was a freshman at Harvard in 1967, and there were many protests going on. I was a kind of a naive kid from the farm, even though I'd read a lot. But I go to Harvard, and one of the targets of protests all over the country was Dow Chemical, because Dow Chemical was a manufacturer of napalm, and there were pictures all over of little kids in Vietnam who had been horribly burned with napalm. They were powerful and compelling and horrifying, and obviously a trigger for protests. So when Dow Chemical would come to a college campus to recruit for employees, there would be huge protests. So I remember in the fall of 67, such a protest took place at Harvard. And I actually didn't happen to directly participate in it, but I remember, maybe I had studying to do or whatever. That was one I missed. But I remember somebody coming through the library and trying to get people out, and they're saying, look, hand in your student ID card now. If you hand it in now, you'll get it back tomorrow. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, it's so scripted, it's so performative. What's this really going to do? You protest, the administration lets you, they forgive you, you're back with your little ID card the next day. And I found it kind of off-putting, I guess. Meanwhile, I had been thinking about the whole situation of being in college in those years. The draft was in place, and the military draft. But if you were in college, an undergraduate, or even in some kinds of graduate school, you got a deferment. You didn't have to, the draft would be put off and put off and put off for years and years and years. So people like Trump, for example, got many deferments. All the people we call chicken hawks, like Cheney and Trump and John Bolton and many others who are now the biggest talkers for war around, they didn't serve. They got their student deferments. I decided, no, I'm not going to take a deferment. I'm going to turn in my draft card, send it back to my draft board, say that I'm not going to cooperate with the draft, and I don't want your student deferment. I'm not going to hide behind the walls of this university and shelter here. I'll throw myself out there, and when I get drafted and inducted, I'll refuse induction, and that I knew would and did lead me to go to federal prison. So that was a short, but that moment of that demonstration, which I didn't even attend, was kind of like a pinnacle moment where I said, no, this is not right. The whole thing is wrong. I'm not going to hide. And that was that.
Nice. Can you recall the social climate at the time during the Vietnam War? Were people fiercely divided on the conflict?
I kind of alluded to this earlier, and I'll elaborate a little bit, but in your earlier question, you asked, well, did I meet with resistance from friends, family, from the general public? The short answer was no. And yeah, there were divisions, and yet they were not like they've been portrayed. And I can explain. When there was a peace demonstration, one of the main slogans, would be support the troops, bring them home now. And there was a strong connection between the troops who were serving in Vietnam and the anti-war movement. And that's sort of been erased from history. And it's been replaced with a lie, basically, which was that, when the troops came home from Vietnam, and you hear this over and over again, it's become it's been internalized, and it's part of the oral history, I guess, of the era, but it's wrong. The troops would come home, and they'd be in an airport home from Vietnam, and hippies or anti-war protesters would spit on them and curse at them and call them baby killers and verbally abuse them. And that's so untrue and so undocumented and such a lie about the actual climate and the actual social dynamics of the era. And one sort of image or test you can apply to that is, what do you think would happen if a scraggly, somewhat wimpy hippie came up to a uniformed Green Beret, a burly, strong, tough guy who had just spent a year or two in Vietnam, and spit in his face? I don't think if you're a quote peace person, unquote, I don't think you'd want to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think it would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And furthermore, if you scour, and people have scoured, the newspapers, the news accounts of the day, find one verified account of anything like that happening. A court record, a newspaper article, a photograph, an item that documents that happening. That was not the dynamic. And as I mentioned earlier, the friends I had from childhood who went and served in Vietnam never gave me any hassle whatsoever. In fact, when they came home from Vietnam and I came home from prison, we got along as well or better than we ever had. No, not. But let me qualify what I said about divisions. Yeah, I was in prison, and I missed a lot of the pitched battles that took place in 68, 69, and 70. I was in prison before the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 68, which was a big clash. I was still there when Kent State happened in 1970. I was there when there were huge mobilization against the war demonstrations in 69. So I missed a lot of the big events because at that time I'm on a prison farm in Ellenwood, Pennsylvania, taking care of cows, and really it's sort of a quiet life compared to a lot that was happening on the streets, but. But it didn't play out in my view, even wherever I was, whatever my vantage point was, as everybody, it was all like everybody's on one side here, everybody's on the other side there, and they hate each other. It was more complicated than that, and I didn't experience it that way myself.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I would like to give context to listeners that a lot of these questions I have oriented are based more of comparing how things are today in our current genocide situation with how things were back then. Because I know from scouring the internet and being online and talking to people that there is definitely a fierce division of people saying like, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself and Israel has gone way too far. And of course there's clashes on those sides of people, I guess, not really taking in like the, yes, Israel might have a right to defend itself, but they've killed like tenfold the amount of people that were originally killed in that original like attack.
Right. More than I'd say safe. I think it's safe to say much more than tenfold. Much more than tenfold, according to the numbers. And it's hard to get reliable numbers. But and I'd like to come back to what's going on now, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more. But as far as I know there are divisions, and I think what I'm seeing now and what I find really maybe most disturbing now is that, well, it's kind of like the difference between what was happening when we first met, Wayne, last spring and when we met again this fall. Tent encampments had popped up all over the country, on campuses all over the country, and people, and I give young people huge amounts of credit for their courage in standing up and saying something. And so they were back in the spring, and so they still are now to some extent. But in the meantime, university administrations everywhere, almost everywhere, especially on campuses where there was the most active protest, spent a good part of their summer figuring out how to crack down on these protests, how to keep calm, how to keep everybody, going along with whatever they're doing, not talking this up, not looking at it, not saying anything about it. And I guess in a word, what I find most disturbing now is that the way the state apparatus comes down on dissenters, protesters, now is much more sophisticated, much more high-tech, much more thorough than it was in my day. This morning I made the mistake of opening up on my computer like Harvard Alumni Magazine. And there was a first big article, oh, we're off to a smooth start this fall. Thank God, it's a smooth start now. People have learned to be civil to each other now. And just in case they're not, we have step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in heavier and heavier discipline that we will come down, that we will impose on people who violate our codes of conduct. So I see this high-tech apparatus, filming things, photographing everybody, taking names, ordering that certain things can't be said, having these speech codes. I call it like an enforced civility. I mean, civility is okay, but if it's like imposed upon the public or upon, say, a student body somewhere. If civility is imposed as some kind of code of conduct, which you can be punished for violating, then really, is that really going to create more civility? Is that really going to allow for more honest discussion and real honest truth-seeking and freewheeling, zealous debate where both sides can really clash and the ideas are really tested? I think not. I mentioned earlier when we talked that I'm like a retired defense lawyer. I did a lot of things, but mostly criminal defense. So the kind of civility that Harvard is saying now you must practice, it kind of reminds me of something I would see occasionally when I had an assault and battery case in court. And if I lost it, and I hated to lose them, but believe it or not, I lost quite a few. and often this would be a case where some drunk person assaulted a police officer. And so part of the punishment would be you have to write a letter of apology to the police officer. Okay, I mean, you're going to do probation, or maybe you're going to go to jail for 30 days, or you get fined, or whatever the punishment is, it is. But writing a letter of apology, I mean, do you really think someone who's made to write a letter of apology, is that really coming from the heart? Is that doing anybody any good? And it's the same way. Enforce civility. No, it's stupid. And it's oppressive. Having said that, I would also say, and this is something I'm drawing on from the 60s, if you're part of a group, a protest group, and someone in the group is suggesting that you do something really stupid, like smash up a window or assault somebody or say something really offensive, or racist or whatever, if that's the case, no, use common sense. And also carefully check the credentials of whoever's suggesting these stupid things,
Yes.
because the infiltrators have always been there throughout history. They were there in the 60s suggesting blow up this, blow up that, but they weren't authentic. They were they were outside. They were agents provocateur. And so be careful if you have someone who seems weird and who's suggesting that you do weird things. Be alert. At the same time, I'm not saying at all that one should be timid or shy, because of what's going on right now is not normal. It's really not normal. It's really very alarming. And I think it doesn't take a genius to look at it and say simply that this is wrong.
Yes, yes. Are you seeing parallels in the behavior of people both in the past and the present with, or let me read that again. I read it wrong. Are you seeing parallels in the behavior of people both in the past and now the present with the Palestine/Gazan genocide?
Yeah, you can say, okay, boomer now, but I do feel like the student movement it's drawing on a lot of the best things that happened in the 60s and the 70s. And finally, through years of protest and mobilization, it finally actually made a difference. And the Vietnam War came to an end. And I think ultimately what the kids, I call them the kids, I can say that from the vantage point of a 75-year-old, are doing now is finally going to make a positive difference. And I'd like to jump back just for a second. Something you said earlier about what people on one side say and what people on the other side say.
Yeah.
It was like when people come up to me and say, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? And let us look at the last 100 years since the end of World War I, when the British Empire took over Palestine. And let's look at the numbers of Palestinians who have died compared to the British or the Zionists. And the numbers are like 95% more Palestinians have died than anyone else in these conflicts. So, yes, October 7 was an act of terror and crime, and it should be roundly condemned. I've condemned it. Any attack on civilians is wrong. Having said that, does this look like, I would ask the listeners, especially the veterans, and I know Bridgewater State has an active veterans affairs program, who are students of military history and perhaps have been involved in military campaigns themselves. Does this look like a military campaign to you? How do you compare this to, you pick your war, how do you compare this, what's happening now in Gaza and in Lebanon, and the tactics and the force being used, and the targets, the civilian targets? How do you compare this to other military campaigns you've either studied or participated in? And I think it's enough to raise alarms and no, I don't think students should be forced to be quiet and civil and worry about being called anti-Semitic or because you say something about Israel. One other thing about Israel, and this isn't really the format to go into a long discussion of the history, but Zionism is not the same as Judaism. It should not be equated with or confused with the practices and the traditions of Judaism. And let me add a couple of things. There is a long and honorable and noble, heroic history of Jewish progressivism and dissent and I guess I would say risk-taking and courage in the service of social justice. Anyone who would deny that does not know either recent or long-term history. But there was never a consensus that there should be a state that, never a consensus about state Zionism, and never a consensus that it would be a good idea for the Jewish people to forcibly, or for any part of the Jewish people to forcibly remove another population from their land, and that was somehow in accord with the principles and the teachings of Judaism. And you can look no further than Albert Einstein for one person who held such views, or a writer like Hannah Arendt who held such views. So that's a very important distinction to keep in mind.
Nice. What are some ways you recommend, or what are some ways to recommend people to stay active in their communities over these contingent issues?
I thought a lot about that. I've thought a lot about that, and I just had an email from a friend who was saying, "Oh, my wife's telling me all you can do is vote," and I say, "No, it's not all you can do. It's voting may be one tool in the toolbox that can here and there and from time to time be a useful agent of social change, but it's hardly the only thing." I think it was a great Jewish revolutionary, Emma Goldman, who said if voting made any difference, they would outlaw it. But I'm not saying, I won't go quite that far.
Yeah.
But I guess where I would start, as far as activity in the community and addressing what we're seeing unfolding before us now, I read one thing that really stuck with me. A woman said, what I will do about this is I will not look away. And I think that is where it can start. I will not look away. So, for example, in the New York Times on October 10, there was a piece, I don't know how it got by the editors at the New York Times, which I generally can't stand, but even though I read it every day, but it was Dr. Sidwa, What We Saw, New York Times, October 9, and it was a compilation of 65 doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers in Gaza and what they had seen in trying to treat their patients. And what they saw, and it's tough to read, it's tough to look at.
I did read it.
Good. I'm so glad.
Yeah, I did. I did look at all the things that you put on my paper. I did listen to the Elvis song. It was pretty good.
Oh, good.
But yes, I did. I did read that too. It was indeed a tough read, but it was very, very informative and very eye-opening.
One of the things, and not to belabor it here, but I strongly recommend it, is these doctors and healthcare professionals, 65 of them, cross-referencing each other's work and each other's experience, they see repeated and commonplace cases of preteen kids down to toddlers. We're talking preteens, little kids with with gunshot wounds to the temple, right to the temple, or right to the middle of their chest by sniper fire. So snipers are targeting little children for deadly gunfire, and it really raises some questions. I don't think, again, we should stay silent. There's an old saying that everybody's heard, like silence is complicity. So I think don't look away, don't stay silent. The other big thing I think I would say is read books. Inform yourself, study, read and study. Also, ask your professors, especially the professors in political science or in social justice or international relations. Oh, what do you think about it? And what do you recommend that we read? Give me a list of books, Professor, and then see what they have to say. And then read the books they give you, and go on the net and find other books. I have a list of sources on a little flyer that I hand out, which I think are very good. But those, I'd say, read books, study the history of Palestine, don't look away, and talk to friends. I know people, and now here's one last thing I'll say about old times and in the present. I find it dismaying that so many people from my generation, and many of them I knew who were quote on our side, unquote, how many of them now do not want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. Again, they say, "Oh, all we can do is vote," and don't, please. They'll roll their eyes, and
Yeah.
But that's like, I'm not going to worry too much if people roll their eyes and call me a nut or flip me off or whatever. It's okay. It's nothing. But those would be some of the things I would suggest. Also, the old labor program was, if you go on strike, practice mutual aid. You're not going to get paid, but we can pull together. We can feed each other. We can give each other a couch to crash on. We can take care of each other through the hard times. And that was kind of the best of the 60s and 70s in a way too. We could kind of pull together and take care of each other and find something to eat or somewhere to sleep. And that was sort of part of the spirit of it. So I think the old idea of mutual aid is a good one. And maybe there will be, if people dig in and wake up, maybe there will be like a general strike, and things will get pushed in a good direction in this country.
Nice. Is it okay if I ask you a question that's not on here? I promise it's not too difficult.
Hey, anything.
Okay.
You can, whether it's difficult or not.
I wanted to know how you came across to make your flyers. Like where, like what resources, what was why these sources? Like, are these, have you read these? Have you used these? Like, I want a little bit.
I've read all of them.
Okay, I want a little history behind them.
Okay, I made up the flyer out of thin air. I just, from reading again, I read the New York Times every day, and I hate it, and I find myself getting angrier and angrier.
I also read it every day.
You have to read it. You have to read it, and you have to read all this stuff, and you have to kind of filter it, and you have to correct for the biases of whoever you're reading. But I'm one of these boomers. You can say, Okay, boomer. But
Okay,
I'm kind
boomer.
of like one of the dinosaurs who didn't really change. So I've been active. I got out of prison in 1970 uh, for draft resistance, and I've never really stopped agitating for peace. Even though I'm not all, I don't want people to get the idea I've been, oh, gee, I'm all peace and love and religion, and it's not really that simple. But uh, but I've been reading things like Counterpunch and left literature from the time I was in eighth grade, I guess, and I was reading John Steinbeck to the present. Uh, and I've been studying and following the Israeli Palestine conflict, if you want to call it that. It used to be called that, and I guess that's fair enough. Uh, I started I'll backtrack for a second. In the '60s, when we were all in all the left literature, the Nation magazine, the New Republic magazine, all the left literature was against the Vietnam War. There was always like an exception for Israel, because the left literature of the day was very Zionist. Never asked a question. Palestinians were portrayed as basically, irrational terrorists. Never, no, only slowly seeping into the discourse was talk about the actual history of Palestine and what happened to the Palestinian people. So I started following it, and I went off to law school. I graduated from Harvard in, let's see, 74. I went off to Rutgers Law School and lived in New York City. Rutgers my branch was in Newark, New Jersey. But anyway, when I lived in New York, um, I started reading the New York Times every single day in the morning. Then I'd read the New York Post in the afternoon and read the Village Voice on weekends. Long story. To its credit, the Times did have stories even in the early to mid 70s following the whole settler movement into the West Bank. And I started saying, whoa, this isn't going to work. How can this work? I mean, I hadn't even thought about the actual history of Palestine itself and the creation of the State of Israel. I hadn't even got that far. But I did know that there was supposed to be some place for the Palestinians to live on the in the West Bank, and that settlers were pushing in more and more and more. And there was some coverage in the New York Times, so I started like following this and talking to people. One time, actually, during my time at Harvard, on spring vacation, I had a job I needed some money, so I worked on the Harvard grounds crew. And one of my fellow grounds crew members was this Egyptian kid. And he had an interesting perspective, and we talked. Um, so those ideas started slowly seeping into my mind in my law school years, and I kind of kept reading. So the sources on my flyer just kind of came from a long lifetime of reading left literature. And I know we're running out of time here, but I've probably gone over what you'd allotted. But
I didn't allot. I didn't allot anything.
you didn't allot anything.
No.
Okay. Well, I would totally recommend. I've listed lots of books and sources, but there's a book by an Israeli historian named Ilan Pape called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which gives a very detailed account of what happened particularly in 1948, 47 and 48, both before and after, but in 1947 and 1948, he goes village by village, neighborhood by neighborhood, in what happened in what the Palestinians called the Nakba, the disaster, the great exodus of Palestinians, like 750,000 more or less Palestinians, are driven from their homes. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine, I strongly recommend. Another book I strongly recommend to give a kind of a perspective on these questions is a book called Three Worlds by Avi Shlaim. And the subtitle of that is Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Avi Shlaim was born in Baghdad. He was part of a Jewish community that had been in Iraq for like 2,500 years. And even as late as 1945, when he was born, there was still a vibrant, prominent Jewish community in Iraq, holding important positions of political and financial stature. But they're also deeply part of the Arab culture. And what people often forget is that before the creation of the State of Israel, there were Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and what's called the Maghreb or North Africa, including Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, throughout the region that had been there for hundreds or thousands of years. And so the idea that there's some kind of inherent hatred between Jews and Muslims is completely bogus. People try to suggest, oh, it's just in their DNA. Oh, they've been fighting forever. No, not true. They have not been fighting forever. I'm not here naively claiming that there have not been religious and ethnic conflicts in this part of the world as everywhere else, because that's sort of the story of human history in a way. But to say that it's inevitable, that it's ingrained, that it's incurable, that it's intractable, none of that is true. And now I'll jump to back to the campus protests. One thing that drives me nuts is I hear people, I admit that the old saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is kind of, it's maybe become a little stale and a little overused, and maybe we've heard it too much, just from a public relations point of view. However, I think if one suggests, and this is what I suggest, that everybody from the river to the sea, and in fact, everybody everywhere else in the world, but particularly from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, everybody should have equal rights. Is that wrong? Is that crazy? People go on and on, back and forth between a two-state solution and a one-state solution. I'd say it's fair to say we have one state right there right now. Israel has the power. They have the control. So when is everybody who lives there going to have equal rights? And that's what I mean if I say or hear from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I mean, everybody there should have equal rights. It does not mean massacre the Jews. It does not mean the Jews have to go. And one of the sources who has written extensively about what he calls sharing the land of Canaan is a Palestinian Christian named Mazin Kumsaya, who appears online. I definitely recommend check him out. He's a very incisive writer. I also hear, well, Israel was necessary because a state for the Jewish people was necessary because of the Holocaust. Well, the Holocaust was over for 3 years by the time the state of Israel was declared in May of 1948. And it was not Palestinian villagers and peasants who drove the Holocaust in Europe. I mean, the Germans, Germany and France and England and Italy uh, have a lot to answer for. But I don't think it was the Palestinians who were driven from their homes in 1947 and 1948 who were, responsible for the Holocaust, and um, nor should they have to pay in eternity, in indefinitely, the price for what happened in Eastern and Western Europe.
Thank you so much. Do you have any closing words or anything inspirational?
uh, I'm taking a little pause here.
That's okay. Take your time.
Yes, thank you. No, I think I'm going to cut back to one thing that I mentioned before, because I think it's important. It goes back to my boomer days, and the whole notion about, respect the veterans, and we're never going to make. And I've heard this a million times in liberal circles since, and anti-war circles, whether it was against the wars the U.S. was sponsoring in Central America, or the first and second attacks on Iraq in 1991 and 2003. We keep hearing. I kept hearing in the peace movement and in among the liberal influencers, oh, let us not make that same mistake of disrespecting the veterans. We can't spit on the veterans. We can't insult the veterans. That is so didn't happen. And one last book I would recommend. Look up a book called The Spitting Image. It's by a guy named Jerry Lemke, who is a Vietnam veteran himself, and now a sociology professor, who did a detailed study of that era, and found again that there was a strong, and this was his experience, and it was my experience, his as a Vietnam veteran, mine as a guy who was a draft resistor and went to prison. There was a strong link and friendly relations among veterans and people who wanted peace. We were the same people in large measure. And I think that's what has to happen now. And I think the divisions are, I wish it were, I wish there was more disagreement, but I can barely detect any disagreement between, say, Harris and Trump about substantive disagreement about what we should be doing. But I think there should be and will be a ground roots movement that will put the world back in a healthy direction. So that's kind of my sort of closing argument, I guess.
And my closing words are: remember to eat your vegetables.
Yes, and grow them too.
Yes,
grow them yourself if
grow
you
them
can.
for your community.
Grow them for yourself and your community.
Yes.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Steve. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Wayne, for having me. It's really good of you to invite me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, let me say my thing to the people who don't exist in front of me. And you have been listening to WBIM FM 91.5, Bridgewater State University's Morning News with Wayne, with your host, Wayne. Seeing you tomorrow. Goodbye.